3,200 years ago, in a house in the port city of Ashkelon, a family buried a baby beneath the floor. This was not neglect, and it was not disposal. In the world these people came from, burying an infant under the threshold of the home inside the walls where the living continued to eat and sleep and work was an act of protection, a way of keeping the smallest and most vulnerable member of the household close folded permanently into the architecture of daily life rather than sent away into a separate world of the dead. That single custom, repeated in house after house across the ruins of the city, would end up becoming one of the most important sources of genetic material in the entire history of biblical archaeology. Because those infants sealed beneath floors that nobody would walk on again for 200 years were the children of a people the Hebrew Bible remembers as villains, as the great enemy of ancient Israel, as the nation that produced Goliath and Delilah and generations of border wars. They were the children of the Philistines. And when modern scientists finally opened the ground beneath those floors and pulled genetic material out of infant bones that had never been touched since the moment they were laid to rest, the result did something that 30 years of digging pottery and reading inscriptions had never managed to do. It answered with actual molecular evidence a question that had been argued over since the earliest days of biblical scholarship. Where did the Philistines actually come from? And the answer was not what most people, including most archaeologists, expected to hear. For most of modern history, the Philistines have existed almost entirely as a mirror image, defined by the people who hated them rather than by anything they left behind about themselves. The Hebrew Bible casts them as the perpetual antagonist of early Israel, the people of Goliath, the people who captured the Ark of the Covenant, the people whose name, filtered through Greek and Latin and centuries of European history, eventually became the root of the modern word Palestine itself. But almost everything popularly known about the Philistines came from the writings of their enemies and their rivals, the Israelites who fought them and the Egyptians who fought them even earlier. And almost nothing came from the Philistines' own voice, because the Philistines, unlike the Egyptians or the Babylonians, left behind no surviving body of their own literature, no royal archive, no extended written record explaining who they believed themselves to be. For archaeologists, that absence created one of the longest-running open questions in the study of the ancient Near East. Was this a foreign people who had crossed the sea and settled violently on the coast of Canaan, exactly as ancient legend suggested? Or was the entire story of a foreign Philistine migration a later exaggeration? A piece of biblical myth-making layered onto a population that had actually been sitting in the region all along. The clues pointed in a genuinely foreign direction almost from the beginning. But clues are not proof, and for decades, that was all anyone had. The Hebrew Bible itself states plainly in several separate passages that the Philistines came from a place called Kar, most commonly identified by scholars with the island of Crete, and that they displaced the earlier inhabitants of the land when they arrived. Ancient Egyptian records told a strikingly similar story from a completely independent angle carved into the mortuary temple of Pharaoh Ramesses III at Medinet Habu is a monumental relief depicting a chaotic, desperate battle at the mouth of the Nile. A conflict fought against a confederation of seaborne raiders and migrants that Egyptian scribes lumped together under the label of the Sea Peoples. Among the specific groups named in that inscription is a people the Egyptians called the Peliset, a name that generations of scholars have connected directly to the Philistines. The relief shows ox carts loaded with families and possessions, war chariots and ships packed with warriors, an entire displaced civilization on the move, arriving at Egypt's border sometime around 1176 BCE. At the exact moment when the great interconnected Bronze Age civilizations of the Eastern Mediterranean, the Minoan palaces of Greece, the Hittite Empire in Anatolia, the trading networks that linked Cyprus and Urartu and Crete were all collapsing within the span of a single catastrophic generation. Whoever the Sea Peoples actually were, their arrival in Egypt happened in the middle of one of the most violent, poorly understood periods of societal breakdown in ancient history, a moment modern historians simply call the Bronze Age collapse. To understand why the Sea Peoples were moving at all, it helps to understand just how completely the world they came from was falling apart. In the space of only a few decades, around 1200 BCE, a tightly interconnected network of Bronze Age civilizations that had traded, intermarried, and fought each other for centuries collapsed almost simultaneously. The Mycenaean palace centers of mainland Greece, with their elaborate bureaucracies and long-distance trade in bronze, olive oil, and luxury goods, were burned and abandoned. The Hittite Empire in Anatolia, one of the great superpowers of the age, disintegrated entirely. Major trading cities along the Syrian coast, including the wealthy port of Ugarit, were destroyed and never fully resettled. Historians still argue over the exact causes, pointing to some combination of prolonged drought, catastrophic earthquakes, failures in the long-distance trade networks that kept these societies fed and armed, and internal political collapse. But whatever the precise mixture of causes, the result was a domino effect of societal breakdown that displaced enormous numbers of people within a single lifetime. whole populations that had built their identities around specific palaces, specific trading networks, specific ways of life, suddenly found themselves without a homeland, without a functioning economy, and in many cases without a king. Some of those displaced populations turned to raiding, some turned to migration. Egyptian sources describe wave after wave of these displaced peoples pressing against Egypt's borders by land and by sea. And it is against this backdrop of total regional collapse that the ancestors of the Philistines most likely made their journey across the Mediterranean not as conquerors from a position of strength, but quite possibly as refugees from a world that had simply stopped functioning. For decades, archaeologists digging at Philistine sites along the southern coast of what is now Israel found material culture that reinforced the foreign migration theory without ever definitively proving it. At sites like Ashdod, Ekron, Gath, and Ashkelon, 4 of the 5 great Philistine cities named in the Bible, excavators uncovered pottery styles that looked nothing like the local Canaanite tradition, and everything like the pottery being produced across the Aean world in Cyprus and Crete and mainland Greece. They found evidence of pork consumption in a region where Canaanite populations largely avoided pigs. They found architectural layouts, hearths, and loom weights that echoed a Geon domestic life rather than Levantine tradition. They even found inscribed pottery fragments carrying non-Semitic script, a writing system that did not match the Canaanite alphabet used by their neighbors. Piece by piece, the material record built a strong circumstantial case that a genuinely new population carrying genuinely foreign customs had arrived on this coastline sometime around the 12th century BCE and rapidly established itself as a distinct and powerful culture. But circumstantial evidence built from pottery shapes and cooking habits is not the same as proof of actual human migration. Cultures can borrow styles from their trading partners without a single person ever moving. Ideas travel. So do fashions and recipes and pottery techniques carried along trade routes by merchants who never leave home. What the archaeological record could not do, no matter how much material was pulled out of the ground, was prove that actual bodies, actual families, actual reproducing populations of people had physically crossed the Mediterranean and settled among the existing Canaanite inhabitants of the coast. For that kind of proof, you need something pottery can never give you. You need the people themselves. You need their bones. And for 30 years, at one of the largest and longest-running excavations in the region, nobody had found a single Philistine grave. The Leon Livby expedition to Ashkelon had been digging at the site continuously since 1985, uncovering layer after layer of one of the most important seaports in the ancient Mediterranean, a city inhabited across 22 distinct historical layers stretching from the Bronze Age all the way through the Crusades. Led for decades by the Harvard archaeologist Lawrence Stagger and later by Daniel Master of Wheaton College, the team had spent 3 decades pulling astonishing material out of the ground, including monumental city gates nearly 4,000 years old and rich troves of gold and silver jewelry demonstrating the city's commercial power. But through all 30 years of digging, the expedition had never located an actual Philistine burial ground, the one thing that would let researchers finally study the people themselves rather than just their pottery. Then, in the expedition's final planned season in 2016, a retired employee of the Israel Antiquities Authority mentioned almost in passing that during a construction survey decades earlier in the early 1980s, he recalled uncovering what looked like burials just outside the city's northern wall. That single offhand recollection led the team directly to the discovery that Stagger himself would later describe as making 99% of everything previously written about Philistine burial customs obsolete overnight. Excavating the site from 2013 through 2016, the team uncovered an Iron Age cemetery containing well over 200 individuals, buried in simple oval pits dug directly into the earth in built stone tombs, and in a small number of cremation jars, a mixture of practices that immediately struck researchers as far more consistent with Aean burial traditions than with anything typical of the surrounding Canaanite world. Unlike Egyptian burials of the same era, packed with elaborate grave goods meant to accompany the dead into an afterlife, the Philistine dead at Ashkelon were interored modestly, some with a small piece of jewelry, others with a simple ceramic vessel or a tiny perfume juglet, and little else. It was the first Philistine cemetery ever excavated at any of the 5 core Philistine cities, and it finally gave researchers direct physical access to actual Philistine skeletons, spanning the 10th and 9th centuries BC. And crucially, alongside those adult burials in the cemetery, the excavation also connected to something the team had recovered years earlier and even more remarkable in scientific terms: the skeletons of infants buried not in the cemetery at all, but directly beneath the floors of Philistine houses, dating specifically to the 12th century BCE, on the exact generation in which the Philistines are believed to have first arrived on this coast. Bone samples from across these burials, spanning roughly 3.5 centuries, were sent for testing undergoing DNA analysis, radiocarbon dating, and detailed skeletal study in an international collaboration between the Leon Levy expedition and geneticists from the Max Planck Institute for the Science of Human History in Germany. Of the more than 100 sets of remains eventually examined across every era of the site's occupation, only 10 individuals yielded genetic material well preserved enough for full genome-wide analysis. A familiar and frustrating ratio in ancient DNA work where heat, humidity, and thousands of years of chemical decay destroy far more genetic evidence than they ever preserve. But 10 individuals, spread carefully across 3 distinct time periods, turned out to be exactly enough. 3 of the oldest skeletons came from Middle to Late Bronze Age tombs, radiocarbon dated to roughly the 17th and 16th centuries B.C.E., representing the Canaanite population of Ashkelon before the Philistines ever arrived. 4 came from the 12th century B.C.E., the infants buried beneath the floors of early Iron Age houses, representing the generation that lived through or was born immediately after the Philistines' initial arrival. And 3 more came from the 10th and 9th century B.C.E. cemetery, representing the established settled Philistine population several centuries after that arrival, the direct genetic descendants of whoever had shown up 200 years earlier. Laid out in sequence like this, the 10 skeletons form something extraordinarily rare in ancient genetics. A genetic time series, a set of snapshots capturing the same population in the same city before, during, and after the single most debated cultural transformation in their entire history. It gave researchers a chance to watch a population change or fail to change across time using nothing but the actual chemistry of their bones. The results published in the journal Science Advances in July of 2019 by a research team including Michael Feldman, Daniel Master, and the senior geneticist Johannes Kreyer were unambiguous, and they landed on a question that had been argued over in academic circles for more than a century. The 3 oldest individuals, the Bronze Age Canaanites who lived in Ashkelon before the Philistines ever set foot on the coast, showed a genetic profile that was essentially indistinguishable from the broader local Levantine population of the era. No surprises there. But the 4 infants from the 12th century B.C.E., the generation buried beneath the floors of the earliest Philistine houses, told a completely different story. Their genomes carried a distinct, statistically clear signal of what researchers labeled European-related ancestry, a genetic component that had simply not been present at any meaningful level in the earlier Bronze Age population of the very same city. Something had changed in the genetic makeup of Ashkelon's residents in the span of time between those Bronze Age burials and the birth of these infants, and that something pointed directly across the Mediterranean toward populations connected to southern Europe, to the Aean world, to islands like Crete, to regions of Greece, and even parts of the Iberian Peninsula. When the research team modeled exactly which ancient population best explained this new genetic signal, one of the strongest supported models placed a very large share of the incoming ancestry, close to half, as tracing directly back to a Bronze Age population sampled from Crete, the island the Bible names, more than 2,000 years before anyone had the tools to test the claim as the literal homeland of the Philistines. Sit with that for a second, because this is the moment where a piece of ancient religious text, a peer-reviewed genome paper, end up pointing at the exact same island. Generations of biblical scholars had debated whether the reference to Kar and Deuteronomy and Amos and Jeremiah was literal history, garbled legend, or something invented centuries after the fact to explain a population whose real origins had already been forgotten by the time the text was written down. Generations of archaeologists had debated whether the Aean-style pottery and architecture at Philistine sites reflected genuine foreign migration or simply cultural borrowing through trade. And in 2019, a set of infant skeletons pulled out of the dirt beneath collapsed Iron Age houses answered both debates at once, using nothing but degraded genetic fragments extracted from bones that had not seen daylight in 3,200 years. A real biological reproducing population carrying ancestry, traceable specifically to the Aean world and quite possibly Crete itself, had arrived on the coast of Canaan at more or less the exact moment the Bible and the Egyptian temple reliefs both said they had. This was not folklore dressed up as history. It was migration written not into stone or scripture, but into the double helix of children who never lived to see their 5th birthday, sealed under the floor of a home that stood at the absolute beginning of Philistine civilization in the land that would eventually carry their name for 3,000 years. But the most genuinely startling part of the study was not the discovery of the European ancestry itself. It was what happened to that ancestry afterward. Because when the research team turned to the 3rd set of skeletons, the adults buried in the Iron Age cemetery 2 to 3 centuries later, in the 10th and 9th centuries BCE, the sharp genetic signal from Europe had almost completely vanished. These later Philistines, the direct descendants of the very population that had arrived carrying AN DNA, were now genetically almost indistinguishable from their Canaanite and Israelite neighbors. The same populations the Philistines had been fighting, trading with, and marrying into for generations. In the space of somewhere between 6 and 10 generations, the genetic footprint of an entire migrating population had been diluted almost to the point of disappearing, absorbed and dissolved into the much larger surrounding Levantine gene pool through generations of intermarriage between newly arrived settlers and the existing local population. The foreign DNA that had marked the Philistines as biologically distinct from everyone around them in the 12th century BCE was by the 9th century BCE essentially gone, blended so completely into the local population that a geneticist looking only at the later cemetery skeletons without the earlier comparison would never have suspected a foreign migration had happened at all. And this is where the story stops being simply a migration mystery solved and becomes something far stranger and more interesting, a genuine puzzle about the relationship between blood and identity. Because while the Philistines' genetic distinctiveness disappeared within a matter of generations, their cultural distinctiveness did not disappear at all. For the next several hundred years, right up until the Philistine cities were finally destroyed by the Babylonian Empire in the early 6th century BCE. Bars, the descendants of these thoroughly intermarried, genetically absorbed people, continued to identify as Philistines, continued to be recorded by their neighbors and enemies as a separate and powerful political and military force, continued to maintain distinctive pottery styles, distinctive religious practices, and a fierce, well-documented rivalry with the Kingdom of Israel that produced some of the most famous stories in the entire Hebrew Bible, including the account of the young shepherd David facing down the Philistine champion Goliath. Genetically, by the time of that legendary conflict, the population fighting under the Philistine banner likely looked on the level of DNA almost exactly like the population fighting under the Israelite one. And yet, nobody on either side of that conflict would have described them as the same people. Ethnic and cultural identity, this genome revealed with startling clarity, does not require ongoing genetic distinctiveness to survive. A relatively small founding population arriving with a foreign language, a foreign religious system, a foreign set of customs and technologies can be almost completely absorbed at the level of biology within a few centuries, while its descendants continue, stubbornly and successfully, to think of themselves and to be treated by everyone around them as something entirely separate from their neighbors. The Philistines did not survive as a distinct people because they kept marrying only each other. They survived as a distinct people because identity, it turns out, is something a community can choose to maintain long after the biology that originally justified it has quietly dissolved. The Philistines organized themselves throughout their independent history around a confederation of 5 major cities: Ashkelon, Ashdod, and Gaza along the coast, and Ekron and Gath further inland, each apparently governed by its own ruler while cooperating, at least loosely, on matters of shared defense and trade. Now, this kind of city-state confederation, rather than a single centralized kingdom itself, echoes political structures more familiar from the Ayan and Crite world than from the more centralized monarchies typical of the wider Levant. Another thread of circumstantial cultural evidence that lined up neatly with what the DNA would later confirm directly. For roughly 2 centuries after their arrival, archaeological layers of these cities show a genuine flourishing, well-planned streets, imported luxury goods, distinctive painted. Pottery decorated with birds and geometric designs clearly descended from Aean artistic traditions, and evidence of a diet that leaned heavily on foods largely avoided by their Canaanite and Israelite neighbors, including pork, a detail preserved not in any text, but in the actual butchered animal bones excavators pulled out of Philistine trash pits. The biblical narrative remembers the Philistines chiefly as antagonists, the captors of the Ark of the Covenant, the killers of Saul, the nation of the giant Goliath, and the temptress Delilah, who brought down the judge Samson. But archaeology paints a picture of a sophisticated, commercially connected, and culturally confident society that held its own against and at times dominated the early Israelite tribes for the better part of 600 years, right up until the Babylonian king Nebuchadnezzar II finally destroyed Ashkelon in 604 BCE. He and scattered or absorbed whatever remained of a once distinct Philistine population into the wider currents of the ancient Near East. This finding forced a genuine uncomfortable rethink among archaeologists and historians who study cultural transmission and ethnic identity in the ancient world. The prevailing intuition in a great deal of older scholarship, sometimes stated outright and sometimes simply assumed, was that a group's ethnic or cultural identity in the ancient world tracked reasonably closely with actual shared ancestry. That peoples who called themselves by a common name and were recognized by outsiders as a distinct nation were on some basic level also a distinct breeding population. The Ashkelon Genome Time series demonstrated with hard molecular evidence rather than theoretical argument that this intuition can be badly wrong. An immigrant population arriving in relatively modest numbers can trigger an enormous disproportionate cultural transformation. New architecture, new pottery traditions, new cuisine, new religious practice, new written language that entirely reshapes how an entire region organizes itself politically and culturally for centuries. All while that population's actual genetic contribution to the local gene pool becomes statistically almost undetectable within a handful of generations. Prestige, political power, and cultural memory, the study suggested, are extraordinarily durable, far more durable than the genetic footprint of the people who originally carried them across the sea. It is entirely possible, and the Philistines appear to be a textbook case of exactly this, for a people's name, their religion, their military reputation, and their place in the historical record of their enemies to outlast their DNA by well over 1,000 years. There is also something quietly devastating about which skeletons actually made this discovery possible. It was not the warriors, it was not the kings or priests or the metal workers who supposedly brought new technologies across the Mediterranean. It was infants, children who lived only days, weeks, or months, buried beneath the floors of the very first generation of Philistine houses built on that coastline, in a practice meant to keep them close to the family hearth, rather than exile them to a separate burial ground outside the walls of the living. Those small bodies tucked beneath floors that their own parents walked across every single day of their lives ended up preserving entirely by accident of custom the single clearest genetic snapshot available anywhere in the archaeological record of the exact moment a foreign population first put down roots on this coast. If Philistine burial custom in that first generation had instead sent infants to an exposed cemetery outside the city, subject to centuries of additional heat, moisture, and disturbance, this precise genetic fingerprint of the founding migration might never have survived intact long enough for modern sequencing technology to read it at all. The very same custom that treated these children as too precious to send away from the household in death is the reason we can now say with genetic confidence, rather than pure textual inference, that the Bible's account of Philistine origins carried a real historical kernel buried inside it, 200 years old, waiting quietly under a dirt floor in a city by the sea. The Ashkelon study did not answer every question about the Philistines, and researchers involved in the work were careful to note the limits of what a sample of only 10 genomes drawn from a single city can actually prove about an entire civilization that stretched across 5 major cities and multiple centuries. It cannot tell us the precise island or region the migrating population departed from with total certainty, only that the strongest statistical models point toward the alien world broadly, and Cree specifically as leading candidates. It cannot tell us exactly how large the original migrating population was, whether it arrived as a single dramatic wave of refugees fleeing the collapse of Bronze Age civilization in Greece, or as a slower, more staggered series of smaller migrations across several decades. And it cannot fully settle the much larger and still unresolved question of who precisely the wider Sea Peoples Confederation actually was, since the label itself was coined by Egyptian scribes describing an intimidating coalition of many different peoples, only one small piece of which the Philistines apparently represented. What the study did do, with a level of certainty that pottery shards and temple reliefs alone could never provide, was confirm that real people in real reproducing numbers crossed the Mediterranean Sea at the end of the Bronze Age and settled permanently among the existing population of the Levantine coast, exactly as the oldest layers of biblical tradition and the oldest surviving Egyptian records had both insisted independently of one another for more than 3,000 years. Somewhere in the modern city of Ashkelon today, tourists walk over ground that once held Bronze Age tombs, Iron Age houses with infants sleeping eternally beneath their floors, and a 200-body cemetery that took 30 years of excavation to finally locate. Beneath all of it lies a genetic record of one of the most consequential, poorly documented population movements in the ancient Mediterranean world. A record that outlasted the fall of the Philistine cities to Babylon in the 6th century by Yaxi. He outlasted every empire that ever claimed this coastline afterward, Persian, Greek, Roman, Byzantine, and Crusader, and simply waited, encoded in broken strands of ancient DNA for a laboratory in Germany to finally develop the tools capable of reading it. When those tools were finally applied in a modest genetics paper published in the summer of 2019, they confirmed a detail from an ancient religious text that skeptics had dismissed for generations as legend. And they revealed a far stranger and more human truth underneath it, that a people can arrive as genuine foreigners, be almost completely absorbed into the population around them within a few short centuries, and still manage, through nothing but sheer cultural persistence, to remain distinct enough in the eyes of history to be remembered, name intact 3,200 years later, as one of the most famous rivals in the entire biblical record. The infants under the floor never knew any of that. They simply lived briefly in the first houses their parents built on a foreign shore, and in dying, they left behind exactly the evidence future generations would need to finally prove that their parents' migration had actually